Bruce Lee sat alone in the corner booth of the Golden Dragon restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon in 1967, his 27-year-old frame folded into the red vinyl seat with the kind of stillness that suggested complete comfort in his own skin. He wore a simple black polo shirt and dark slacks, nothing flashy, nothing meant to draw attention, and his hands rested flat on the formica table, fingers spread like he was feeling for vibrations in the wood itself. The restaurant hummed with the low murmur of lunch conversations, the clatter of dishes being stacked in the kitchen, the sizzling of wok fires sending clouds of garlic-scented steam into the dining room. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the front windows, cutting geometric patterns across the checkerboard floor, and somewhere in the back, a radio played Cantonese opera at a volume just loud enough to fill the silences between conversations. Bruce was waiting for a friend, another martial artist, someone he'd promised to meet for tea and philosophy. And he'd arrived early because he always arrived early. It gave him time to observe, time to breathe, time to exist in a space without the weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders. In public, he was often recognized now, his appearances on television making his face familiar even to those who'd never set foot in a martial arts school. But here, in this particular restaurant tucked into a side street in Oakland's Chinatown, most of the patrons were older generation immigrants who watched Chinese language programs, not American shows. Here he could be anonymous. Here he could simply be. He lifted his cup of jasmine tea, the porcelain warm against his palm, and took a slow sip, savoring the floral notes, the delicate bitterness, the way the heat traveled down his throat and settled in his chest. The restaurant's owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, moved between tables with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work for 40 years, refilling teapots without being asked, clearing plates before customers had finished chewing their last bites. She'd given Bruce a small nod when he entered, acknowledgement without fuss, and he'd appreciated that. No excitement, no request for autographs or demonstrations, just recognition of his humanity, his right to occupy space without performance. The front door chimed as it opened, and Bruce's eyes flicked toward the entrance out of habit, cataloging without judgment. A young couple entered, holding hands, laughing about something private. Mrs. Chen greeted them and led them to a table near the window. The door chimed again 30 seconds later. This time, 5 men entered in a cluster, their energy immediately different. Louder, more aggressive, taking up more space than their physical bodies required. Bruce's gaze lingered on them for a moment longer. All 5 appeared to be in their 20s, dressed in leather jackets despite the mild weather, their hair slicked back with pomade that caught the afternoon light. They moved with the kind of swagger that suggested they were used to being the biggest presence in any room they entered. The tallest one, maybe 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, scanned the restaurant like he was assessing territory. His eyes passed over Bruce without pause, dismissing him as irrelevant, before settling on a table near the center of the dining room. The group moved toward it without waiting to be seated, chairs scraping loudly against the floor as they pulled them out and dropped into them with theatrical heaviness. Mrs. Chen approached with menus, her expression neutral but her shoulders slightly tense, the kind of physical tightening that suggested she recognized trouble when it walked through her door. Bruce returned his attention to his tea, but his peripheral awareness remained locked on the 5 men. Their voices carried across the restaurant. Too loud for the space, too aggressive for the atmosphere, talking about a fight they'd won the night before, about someone who'd learned his lesson, about how nobody in this neighborhood could touch them. The tallest one, the one with the scarred eyebrow, seemed to be the leader, his voice the loudest, his gestures the most expansive, his laugh the most forced. Bruce recognized the type, men who built their identity on the fear they could generate in others, men who confused intimidation with respect, men who'd never been truly tested, never faced someone who could see through the performance to the insecurity beneath. The group ordered food in voices that sounded more like commands than requests, snapping their fingers at Mrs. Chen when they wanted refills, laughing when she flinched slightly at the sound. Bruce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only visible sign of his internal reaction. He understood bullies. He'd faced them his entire life, first as a skinny Chinese kid in San Francisco, then as a martial artist challenging the traditional establishment, now as an actor trying to break into an industry that wanted to keep him in the background. He'd learned that bullies operated on the same principle regardless of context. They needed audiences. They needed witnesses to validate their dominance. Take away the audience, and the performance lost its purpose. Two other tables of diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their conversations dropping to whispers, their body language curling inward as if trying to make themselves smaller, less noticeable. The young couple near the window exchanged glances. Should we leave? And the woman's hand tightened around her boyfriend's wrist. This was how it worked. This was how 5 men could control a space designed for 50. Not through actual violence, but through the threat of it. Through the atmospheric pressure of potential chaos that made everyone else responsible for avoiding confrontation, for managing the bullies, emotions for shrinking themselves to accommodate aggression. Bruce took another sip of his tea, his hands steady, his breathing unchanged. He'd already made a decision, though he hadn't moved a muscle to indicate it. The decision wasn't about heroism or ego or proving anything. It was simpler than that. It was about what kind of world he wanted to live in. It was about whether 5 men would be allowed to make an entire restaurant full of people feel unsafe in a space where they'd come to share food and conversation. It was about whether Mrs. Chen, who'd shown him kindness by letting him be anonymous, would spend the rest of her afternoon cleaning up after men who treated her dining room like their personal arena. The food arrived quickly, Mrs. Chen clearly hoping that full mouths would quiet the group's aggressive energy. For a few minutes it worked. The 5 men focused on their plates, shoveling fried rice and orange chicken into their mouths with the kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested eating was just fuel, not pleasure. But the silence didn't last. The scarred leader finished first, pushing his empty plate toward the center of the table with deliberate force, the ceramic scraping against wood loud enough to make everyone in the restaurant flinch. "This is garbage," he announced, his voice pitched to Carrie. "I've had better food from a street cart." His companions laughed, too loud, too long, and Bruce recognized it as performance laughter, the kind meant to signal allegiance rather than genuine amusement. Mrs. Chen approached cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her expression carefully neutral in the way that service workers perfected after years of absorbing other people's cruelty. "Is there a problem with your meal, sir?" Her English carried a slight accent, her words precisely chosen. "Problem?" The man leaned back in his chair, balancing it on 2 legs, his arms crossed over his chest. "The problem is you're charging real money for this trash. The problem is you think you can run a restaurant when you can barely speak English." The restaurant went completely silent. Even the sounds from the kitchen seemed to stop, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Mrs. Chen's face didn't change expression, but her hands tightened their grip on each other, knuckles going white against the fabric of her apron. Bruce could see her shoulders pulling inward, her body physically trying to make itself smaller, and something in his chest tightened in response. One of the other men at the table, younger, maybe 23, with acne scars across his cheeks, picked up where his leader left off. "Yeah, and what's with all this Chinese music? This is America. We speak English here. We listen to American music." Another round of laughter from the group, and now Bruce could see the precise dynamics at play. The scarred leader was the instigator, but he had lieutenants who performed for his approval, each trying to outdo the others in cruelty, each hoping to secure their position in the hierarchy by demonstrating their willingness to punch down. This wasn't about Mrs. Chen or her restaurant. This was about a dominance display, about men establishing their pecking order through coordinated assault on someone they perceived as vulnerable. The young couple near the window stood up quietly, leaving money on their table and hurrying toward the exit without making eye contact with anyone. The door chimed behind them, and the scarred leader watched them leave with a satisfied smirk, as if their departure was a victory, proof of his power to clear a room. Mrs. Chen stood frozen near their table, and Bruce could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. If she asked them to leave, would they? If she challenged them, would it escalate? If she called the police, would they arrive in time, and would that only make these men angrier, more determined to prove their dominance? The leader's attention shifted then, scanning the restaurant as if looking for his next target, his next opportunity to demonstrate control. His eyes landed on an elderly man sitting alone near the back, quietly eating soup, and Bruce saw the predatory gleam appear in the bully's expression. The recognition of new prey, someone even less able to fight back than Mrs. Chen. The leader opened his mouth to speak, to say something that would drag the old man into their performance, and that's when Bruce's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "You finished with your food?" Bruce's words were quiet, conversational, delivered without any rise in volume or shift in tone. He hadn't stood up. He hadn't moved from his corner booth. He was still sitting exactly as he'd been sitting when they entered, hands flat on the table, posture relaxed, but now his attention was fully focused on the five men, and there was something in that focus, a quality of absolute presence that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. The scarred leader's head swiveled toward Bruce, surprise flashing across his features before being quickly replaced by aggressive amusement. He'd been so focused on targets he perceived as weak that he hadn't noticed the small Chinese man sitting quietly in the corner. Now, seeing Bruce's unimpressive physical size, his simple clothing, his unassuming posture, the leader's smirk widened into something uglier. "Sorry, you talking to me?" The leader made a show of looking around as if confused about who could possibly be addressing him. "Your food," Bruce repeated, still not moving, his voice carrying that same quiet steadiness. "You finished eating?" The leader pushed his chair back and stood up, his full height and bulk now on display, and Bruce noted the way the man's companions immediately shifted their body language, leaning forward in their seats, energized by the prospect of confrontation. This was what they'd come here for, Bruce realized. The food was just an excuse. They'd been looking for a fight since they walked through the door, and now someone was finally giving them permission to have one. "What's it to you, little man?" The leader took 2 steps toward Bruce's booth, his hands flexing at his sides. "You got a problem with how I run my mouth?" Bruce finally moved, but not in the way anyone expected. He lifted his teacup and took another slow sip, his eyes never leaving the approaching man, and then set it down with deliberate gentleness, the porcelain touching the table without a sound. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before, forcing everyone in the restaurant to strain to hear him. "I don't have a problem. I'm just offering you a chance." "A chance?" The leader laughed, and his companions joined in, their voices creating a chorus of aggressive mockery. "A chance for what?" "To leave before you embarrass yourself." Bruce's hands remained flat on the table, his posture unchanged, sitting comfortably in his booth like this was still a casual conversation about nothing important. The leader's face flushed red, anger replacing amusement, and Bruce watched the shift happen in real time. The recognition that this small man wasn't showing the fear or deference that the performance required, that the script wasn't being followed, that the dominance display wasn't working. When a bully's intimidation failed to produce the expected result, they typically escalated, and Bruce could already see the man's body preparing for it. Weight shifting forward, shoulders tensing, hands curling into fists. "You think you're funny?" The leader was close now, standing right next to Bruce's booth, looming over him, using his height advantage to create physical pressure. "You think you're tough? I think you have 7 seconds to sit down." Bruce's voice didn't change volume or tone, still conversational, still calm, but now there was something else underneath it. Not a threat exactly, but a statement of fact. A law of physics being calmly explained. 7 seconds. The number hung in the air like a promise, and the leader's 4 companions stood up from their table now, moving to flank their leader, creating a semicircle of aggression around Bruce's corner booth. 5 against 1. 5 men standing ready to fight. 1 man still sitting, completely relaxed, hands flat on the table, looking up at them with an expression that somehow managed to communicate both perfect calm and absolute certainty. 7 seconds? The leader's voice cracked slightly on the words, surprise breaking through his aggressive facade. 7 seconds for what? For all 5 of you to remember you have somewhere else to be. Bruce's eyes moved slowly across each of the 5 men, making brief eye contact with each one, and several of them shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, feeling something they couldn't quite name. Not fear of his physical size or obvious strength, but fear of his complete lack of fear, his utter comfort in the moment, his apparent willingness to accept whatever came next without hesitation or doubt. The leader's face went from red to purple, humiliation now mixing with anger in a toxic combination that Bruce had seen before. The specific emotional cocktail that led to irrational decisions, to swings thrown without thought, to violence deployed as a way to salvage wounded pride. The man's right hand came up fast, a wide haymaker aimed at Bruce's face. Telegraph obvious, technique non-existent, just raw aggression trying to land anywhere it could. Bruce moved. He didn't stand up. Didn't need to. His left hand shot up at an angle, deflecting the incoming punch with his forearm, while his right hand, still flat on the table a microsecond before, drove forward in a straight line, fingers extended, striking the pressure point cluster just below the leader's solar plexus. The impact was precise, controlled, generating just enough force to disrupt the man's diaphragm without causing lasting damage. The leader's forward momentum stopped instantly, his body freezing mid-swing as his respiratory system temporarily forgot how to function, his mouth opening in a silent gasp as his brain sent urgent signals that his lungs couldn't process. 1 second. The leader stumbled backward, both hands clutching his chest, his face cycling rapidly through confusion, shock, and the beginning of panic that comes when breathing stops being automatic. His four companions stared for a fraction of a moment, processing what they'd just witnessed, trying to reconcile the speed and precision of Bruce's movement with his continued seated position, before instinct and loyalty overrode thought and two of them lunged forward simultaneously. The one from the left, the younger man with the acne scars, reached for Bruce's shirt collar. Bruce's body rotated in his seat, using the booth's back support as an anchor point, and his left leg came up in a smooth arc, the instep of his foot connecting with the side of the young man's knee with a sharp snap that sent him sideways into the booth's table edge. The man crumpled, hands going to his leg, a sound escaping his throat that was half curse and half whimper. 2 seconds. The one from the right, thicker build, moving slower but with more mass behind him, tried to grab Bruce by the shoulders, attempting to use his weight advantage to pin the smaller man against the booth. Bruce's hands moved in opposite directions simultaneously, his left shooting up to trap the man's right wrist while his right drove down to strike the inside of the man's left elbow, hyperextending the joint just enough to generate intense pain without causing structural damage. The man's forward momentum carried him into the booth's table and Bruce used it, guiding the man's own force to fold him over the formica surface, his cheek pressed against the wood. Next to Bruce's teacup, his arm twisted behind his back in a position that made any movement send lightning bolts of pain through his shoulder. 3 seconds. The fourth man, the smartest of the group apparently, stopped his advance halfway, feet planted, hands coming up in what might have been an attempt at a defensive posture if he'd had any actual training. Bruce finally stood up then, stepping out of the booth with the kind of fluid grace that suggested his body operated according to different physical laws than everyone else's. His movement so smooth it looked slow until you realized how much distance he'd covered in the time it took to blink. He closed the gap between himself and the fourth man in 2 steps, his hands moving faster than the man's eyes could track. A feint to the face that drew the man's guard up, followed immediately by a low side kick to the outside of his lead leg that swept his foundation out from underneath him. The man went down hard, landing on his back with an impact that knocked the air from his lungs, his head bouncing once against the linoleum floor with a dull thud. 5 seconds. The fifth man, the one who'd been sitting farthest from the initial confrontation, had used those 5 seconds to back away, his hands coming up in a universal gesture of surrender, his face pale, his eyes wide, the aggressive swagger completely evaporated and replaced with the kind of animal fear that comes from watching 4 of your companions neutralized in less time than it takes to tie your shoes. Bruce turned to face him, and the man took another step backward, then another, his heel hitting the leg of an empty chair and nearly sending him stumbling. "You still have 2 seconds," Bruce said, his breathing completely normal, not even slightly elevated, as if he'd just finished a leisurely walk rather than dismantling 4 attackers. "I'd use them." The fifth man didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran for the door, yanking it open hard enough that the chime jangled violently and disappeared into the afternoon sunlight outside. The door swung shut behind him, the chime gradually settling into silence, and the restaurant held its collective breath. 7 seconds. It had taken exactly 7 seconds. Bruce surveyed the scene with the clinical detachment of someone assessing their work. The scarred leader was on his knees now, still gasping for air, his hands pressed against the floor to keep himself from falling over completely. The younger man with the acne scars was curled in a fetal position near the booth, clutching his knee, tears streaming down his face. The thick one was still bent over the table, not moving because Bruce still held his arm in that position, where the slightest pressure would send pain shooting through every nerve pathway. The fourth man was flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, conscious but stunned, like he was trying to figure out what dimension he'd just been transported to. Bruce released his grip on the thick man's arm, stepping back to give him space, and the man immediately pulled away, stumbling toward his companions, cradling his elbow against his chest. The restaurant was completely silent now, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pregnant with collective shock and something like awe. Mrs. Chen stood near the kitchen entrance, one hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide. The elderly man in the back had stopped eating his soup, his spoon suspended halfway to his mouth. The remaining diners all stared at Bruce like they'd just witnessed something impossible, something that violated their understanding of how reality worked. Bruce walked slowly back to his booth, his movements calm and deliberate, and sat down exactly where he'd been sitting before, in exactly the same position, his hands returning to their flat position on the table. He picked up his teacup, which somehow hadn't spilled a single drop, despite everything that had happened in the last 7 seconds, and took a sip. The jasmine tea was still warm. The scarred leader had finally recovered enough breath to speak, though his voice came out as a hoarse whisper, all the previous swagger and aggression completely absent. What? What are you? Bruce set his cup down and looked at the man, really looked at him, his eyes neither angry nor triumphant, just clear and direct, the gaze of someone who sees through performance to the frightened boy underneath. Someone who knows the difference between strength and cruelty. The leader's face crumpled then, not with physical pain, but with something deeper, more fundamental. Shame. Real shame. Not the performative kind that bullies use to manipulate sympathy, but the genuine article. The recognition of how far he'd fallen from whatever better version of himself he might once have imagined becoming. His 3 conscious companions were pulling themselves together now, helping each other up, and Bruce watched them with that same clear, direct gaze, waiting. You could have hurt us. The thick man spoke, still cradling his elbow, his voice carrying genuine wonder. You could have broken bones, sent us to the hospital, but you didn't. Bruce nodded once, a small acknowledgement. Breaking you would have been easy. Teaching you costs more. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water, and Bruce could see them ripple through the 5 men's consciousness, each processing the implication at their own speed. They'd walked into this restaurant as predators, convinced of their dominance and secure in their ability to intimidate and control. They'd been prepared for resistance, maybe even wanted it, craved it as validation of their toughness. But they hadn't been prepared for precision. They hadn't been prepared for control. They hadn't been prepared to be dismantled with such surgical accuracy that even in defeat they were forced to recognize they'd been shown mercy. Why? The scarred leader's voice cracked on the word, and when Bruce looked at him, he could see the man's eyes were wet, his tough guy mask completely dissolved. Why didn't you destroy us? We would have. If we'd won, we would have. I know what you would have done, Bruce interrupted, his voice gentle now, almost kind. That's exactly why I didn't do it to you. Because someone needs to show you there's another way. Someone needs to demonstrate that real power looks nothing like what you've been practicing. The silence stretched out and Bruce let it, understanding that transformation required space, required time for new ideas to find purchase in old patterns. The 5 men stood clustered together now, all their earlier confidence replaced with the awkward uncertainty of people who'd just had their worldview violently rearranged. The 4th man, the one who'd ended up on his back, finally found his voice. I don't understand. You sat there and warned us. You gave us a chance to leave. Why would you do that if you knew you could? He gestured vaguely at his companions' various states of disarray. If you knew you could handle us? Bruce leaned back in his booth, his posture relaxing even further, if that was possible, his hands coming to rest on the table's edge. Because fighting isn't about winning. It's about what you win for. It's about what kind of world you create with your victories. I didn't fight you to prove I was stronger. I fought you to give you the chance to become better. The scarred leader wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture unconsciously childlike, stripped of all adult pretense. How? How do we do that? And there it was. The question Bruce had been waiting for, the moment when the door cracked open, just enough to let new possibilities slip through. He could have simply let them leave, let them carry their shame and confusion back into the world to make sense of as best they could. But that wasn't teaching. Teaching required one more step, one more offering, one more demonstration that strength could be constructive rather than destructive. Start by apologizing to Mrs. Chen, Bruce said, nodding toward the restaurant owner who still stood near the kitchen entrance, watching everything unfold with the wary expression of someone who'd learned not to trust quick transformations. Then pay for your meals, leave a generous tip, and walk out of here understanding that every person you meet is carrying struggles you know nothing about. Every person deserves the dignity you've been demanding for yourself but denying to others. The five men turned to look at Mrs. Chen, and the elderly woman's expression shifted from wariness to something softer, more complex. The look of someone watching young men choose between paths, understanding the weight of that choice. The scarred leader moved first, walking slowly toward her, his previous swagger completely absent, his movements uncertain like he was learning to walk for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was so quiet that Bruce almost didn't hear it. "I'm sorry for what we said, how we acted, what we made you feel. You didn't deserve any of it." Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for sincerity, for genuine transformation rather than tactical manipulation, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied something because she nodded once, a small gesture that somehow carried enormous weight. "You pay, you go, you do better." Her English was still accented, her words still carefully chosen, but now there was strength in them, the kind of strength that comes from surviving decades of other people's cruelty and still choosing to accept their apologies when they finally arrive. The five men pooled their money, more than enough to cover their meals, and left it on their table along with additional bills that constituted an apology tip, compensation for the emotional labor they'd extracted. They moved toward the door as a group, subdued, their body language completely transformed from the aggressive swagger they'd carried when they entered. The scarred leader paused at the exit, his hand on the door handle, and turned back to look at Bruce one more time. "What's your name?" he asked. So I know who." "It doesn't matter," Bruce said, though his tone was gentle, not dismissive. "What matters is what you do next. What matters is who you become from this moment forward." The leader nodded slowly, processing this, and then he pushed open the door and led his companions back out into the afternoon sunlight. The chime rang as the door closed behind them, and the restaurant released a collective breath, the tension that had filled the space finally beginning to drain away. Mrs. Chen approached Bruce's booth slowly, and when she reached it, she stood there for a moment in silence, her hands folded in front of her apron, her expression thoughtful. Then she reached out and patted his shoulder once, a gesture that communicated volumes without requiring words. Gratitude, respect, recognition of what he'd done, and why he'd done it. "You good man," she said simply. "Very good man." Bruce shook his head, a small smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Just someone who knows that broken people don't need to be broken more. They need to be shown there's a way to rebuild." Mrs. Chen nodded, patted his shoulder once more, and then returned to her work, moving between tables, refilling teapots, restoring normalcy to her dining room with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd weathered countless storms and always found a way to keep her doors open. The other diners gradually returned to their meals, though Bruce could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispered conversations speculating about who he was, where he'd learned to move like that, whether he was someone famous they should recognize. He finished his tea slowly, savoring the last drops, and then stood to leave, placing money on the table for his own bill, plus a tip that would make Mrs. Chen smile when she discovered it. As he walked toward the door, the elderly man who'd been eating soup near the back called out to him in Cantonese, asking if he taught classes, if he took students, if there was a way to learn what he knew. Bruce paused at the door and turned back, responding in the same language. "I teach, but the real lessons have nothing to do with fighting. They have everything to do with when not to fight, and what you do when fighting becomes necessary." The old man nodded, understanding passing between them in the way it can between people who've lived enough to recognize wisdom when they hear it. And then Bruce pushed open the door and stepped out into the Oakland afternoon, the chime ringing one last time behind him. He walked down the street at his usual pace, unhurried, present, aware of everything around him without seeming to focus on anything in particular. And if anyone had been watching him leave, they would have seen just a small Chinese man in a black polo shirt and dark slacks. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would suggest they'd just witnessed 7 seconds that would ripple through those five men's lives for decades to come. Because that's what real teaching looks like. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or demand recognition. It plants seeds in moments of crisis and trusts that, given the right conditions, those seeds will grow into something better than what existed before. Bruce understood this in a way that most people never would. That true mastery wasn't about accumulating victories or destroying opponents. True mastery was about creating the conditions for transformation, about offering people the chance to become better versions of themselves, even when they'd given you every reason to simply punish them and move on. Years later, long after Bruce Lee had become a household name, after his films had made him an international icon, after his philosophy had been studied and his techniques had been analyzed, and his legacy had been debated by scholars and practitioners alike, a journalist would track down the five men from that Tuesday afternoon in Oakland. By then, they'd all taken different paths, but they'd all taken better ones. The scarred leader had become a youth counselor, working with at-risk kids in underserved communities, teaching them that strength could be constructive rather than destructive. The younger man with acne scars ran a small business that employed people others had written off as unemployable. The thick one taught conflict resolution workshops in prisons. The fourth one mentored teenage boys in foster care. The fifth one, the one who'd run, funded community programs that offered alternatives to violence for young men who'd never been shown there were other options. When the journalist asked each of them separately what had changed, what had made them choose different paths, they all pointed back to the same 7 seconds in a restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon in 1967. They all remembered the feeling of being defeated so completely, so precisely, that they were forced to recognize how much restraint had been exercised on their behalf. They all remembered the moment when they understood that the man who just dismantled them had done so while simultaneously offering them something infinitely more valuable than revenge: the opportunity to learn. He could have destroyed us, the scarred leader told the journalist, his voice carrying the weight of decades of reflection. But destruction would have been selfish. It would have been about his ego, his victory, his ability to punish us for our cruelty. Instead, he chose to teach us. And that taught us more than any beating ever could have. It taught us that real power isn't about domination. It's about what you create with your strength. It's about the world you choose to build with your victories. The journalist's article, when it was published, focused on those 7 seconds and the decades of ripple effects they'd created, the lives transformed, the violence prevented, the generational cycles broken. The article asked a question that Bruce himself would have appreciated. How many moments in your life could become those 7 seconds? How many times have you been given the choice between destroying someone who wronged you and teaching them how to be better? And what did you choose? Because that's the truth that Bruce Lee understood in his bones. The truth he demonstrated on a Tuesday afternoon in Oakland while sitting in a corner booth drinking jasmine tea. The real measure of your strength isn't determined by how many fights you win or how many opponents you defeat. The real measure of your strength is determined by what you do with your victories. Do you use them to elevate yourself at others' expense? Or do you use them to create the conditions where even your former enemies can transform into something better? 7 seconds. That's all it took to stop a fight. But the lesson from those 7 seconds is still teaching people today, still rippling outward, still demonstrating that the most powerful thing you can do with your strength is offer it in service of other people's growth rather than your own glorification. And somewhere, in whatever dimension masters go when their physical time is done, Bruce Lee is probably sitting quietly, hands flat on a table, smiling that small smile that suggests he knew all along that the real fight was never about winning. It was about what you teach in the process of winning, and whether those lessons create more violence or more wisdom in the world you leave behind. Think about the last time you won an argument. The last time you were right and someone else was wrong. The last time you had the power to destroy someone's dignity with the truth of their failures. What did you do with that victory? Did you grind their face in it? Did you make sure they felt every ounce of their shame and humiliation? Did you use your correctness as a weapon to inflict maximum damage? Or did you do what takes infinitely more strength? Did you offer them a path forward? Did you show them how to be better without destroying who they are? Did you plant seeds that might grow into transformation years from now when they're finally ready to receive the lesson? Bruce Lee chose his path in 7 seconds on a Tuesday afternoon in Oakland. The 5 men who walked into that restaurant as bullies walked out as students, carrying a lesson they'd spend the rest of their lives unpacking, applying, sharing with others who needed to hear it. What path are you choosing? What are you teaching with your victories? What kind of world are you creating in the 7 seconds when you have all the power and someone else has none? Because that's when your true character reveals itself, not in the moments when you're struggling or fighting or trying to survive. In those moments when you've already won, when you've already proven your strength, when you're standing over someone who wronged you and you have the absolute power to make them pay for it. What happens in your 7 seconds? What do you choose to teach? That's the lesson. That's always been the lesson. And it started with a small man sitting in a corner booth, hands flat on a table, demonstrating that real power whispers while weakness shouts, that real strength teaches while weakness destroys, and that the most difficult fight you'll ever win is the fight to remain merciful when you have every reason not to be. 7 seconds. What will you do with yours?